Okay, welcome everybody. We are going to get started. I'm a big proponent of starting on time. So we're going to be looking at what I consider one of the more fascinating topics in Zionism, which is Zionism and the Jewish question. The Jewish question is sort of something that we don't ask anymore since Zionism reached its first goal of establishing a Jewish state. So it's not a question that's readily that's asked, but for 200 years was the one of the biggest questions being asked around the world, not just in Zionist circles. In fact, I would venture to say that it was more in non-Jewish, even anti-Semitic circles, that it was asked more than in Jewish circles, but it was still very much asked in Jewish circles as well. So that's what we're going to be asking. But I want to, before we begin, I think that it really it's important before we could really start on understanding the Jewish question. I think it's important that we review a little of what we've done in the past, just so we could properly understand the context of where this Jewish question comes into play. So if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, this will be a review for you. And if you weren't with us, then this will be either new information, hearing it from us, or a review of information you've heard in the past. So the first, we've had two lectures, and the two lectures that we've had have covered. The first one was discussing what Zionism is, the definition of Zionism, and the second was the question of when Zionism began. Excuse me. Pardon me. So those were the two topics. When we talk about what Zionism is, the definition of Zionism, so we talked about Zionism being a compound of four different elements. We talked about how Zionism, the first element of Zionism is the fact that the Jews are a people and not just a religion. The second idea was that as a people we had national rights. And one of those national rights was the right of self-determination, that nobody can tell us what's best for us and what we should do. That's only we are the only ones that can decide that. That's one of the rights, and the last element, the last part of it, is that one of the rights that we have is not just self-determination, but a right to our own homeland, a right to our historic homeland, and that's the land of Israel. So those were the four elements that were people, that we have national rights as a people, that we get to determine our own future. No one can tell us what's best for us. We alone can determine that as a people, and that we have a right to our historic homeland, the land of Israel. Those are the four elements that composed Zionism. Okay. Then last week we examined when Zionism began, and we examined whether Zionism begins with Herzl in the late 1800s, or is Zionism not just a movement, but it's really an ideology that starts far before Herzl, and we even suggested that it could go back to the times of Abraham, where Abraham is told by God to go to the land of Israel, and that's where the ideology of Zionism begins. So, and if the ideology of Zionism begins there, and Zionism is more than just a movement, but is really based on an ideology, then that's where we should begin. What we call Zionism is really thousands upon thousands of years ago, and Herzl's movement of this political modern movement of Zionism is really just a political I guess movement. We'll just keep using the same word, political movement, to actualize the ideology that had been around for thousands of years of the Jewish people returning. And Herzl's real greatness would have been then putting that ideology into action for the first time in thousands of years. So that's what we've been doing the last couple weeks. The question that then begs itself is, okay, what really was inspiring the Zionists of the late 1800s to all of a sudden go ahead and begin to begin to move back to Israel. In other words, for let's say 2,000 years, I think that in my research, I'm starting to realize it's a lot less than 2,000 years, meaning that not that we weren't exiled for 2,000 years, but that Jews were in Israel for, I think, really until about the 700s. I'm starting to realize that that colloquially, this idea of being in exile for 2,000 years might be not everybody, but that's for a different story. That's a different time. But why all of a sudden, after hundreds of years or thousands of years, did Herzl all of a sudden and the Jews all of a sudden wake up and say, okay, as a nation, we can now go back? What was it that really got them moving and got them going to return? And that's really the question. That's where this idea of the Jewish question comes into play. Okay, and as we know, all questions all questions are designed to have solutions. Not all questions do have solutions. We try to find a solution to a question. We're problem solvers by nature as human beings, and we try to find a solution. And this ties when we start looking and realizing that for hundreds of years before Zionism takes off, there was the Jewish question. If you're a student of history, so then you already know what the Jewish question is. And you're sitting here saying, oh, I know what he's talking about. And that's perfectly fine. But if you're not a student of history and your historical knowledge comes just in the context of modern times and being able to understand modern times based on the history of what went on beforehand, so then the Jewish question has really fallen out of popularity in terms of things that people talk about. The Jewish question does not exist anymore. Nobody asks the Jewish question. What's the Jewish question? What is this question finally? So the Jewish question is, what do we do with the Jews? That's what the non-Jews were asking. Let's take life back to the 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s, and really all the way until the mid 1900s, as we know. And Jews were spread out through all of these lands, right? Jews were spread out through all of Europe, and they were both ger v'toshav, as the Bible says. They were both a stranger and a resident. So they lived in these countries. So they were, let's say, loyal Germans. They served in the German army. They were loyal Frenchmen, loyal English people, and they were in these countries, but they were still always considered outsiders. They weren't nobody. The non-Jews looked at them and welcomed them only insofar as they needed them. They didn't really look at them in the same way. So there was always this struggle of Jews trying to fit in, while at the same time being kept out. By the way, I just want to reiterate, I find it very difficult to talk straight for 35 minutes and just keep teaching. So if there's something I say that you object to or need clarification on, or just want to add to, so please chime in. Don't wait for me to pause. Okay. So and excuse me 1 second. I have a cold, so I apologize. But so the question is, the Jewish question was asked, which is, if you're sitting in Germany and you're a German and you're not a Jew, so you look at the Jews and say, okay, what are we going to do with these Jews? They don't belong here. They're not like us. They're not Germans like us. And the French are asking the same question. What are we going to do with all these Jews? These Jews are here, but they're not us. They're not natural French people. Now, Jews felt, right, this the charge of dual loyalty, the charge of not being equal to everybody else. This is a very offensive charge, right? If we say this to Americans today and say Jews aren't real Americans, that's an incredibly offensive comment to make to American Jews. And there's no reason why a Jewish American is any less American than an African American, an Asian American, a French American, whoever it is, right? There's that hyphen doesn't take away from the second part of the sentence, right? Just because you are something else besides American or you stem from somewhere doesn't mean that you're any less of an American. But if we're sitting in Europe 200 years ago, you better believe that the Jewish part of you isn't just an addition, it's actually taking away from your ability to be considered a citizen of the country that you're from. So non Jews are asking, what are we going to do with these Jews? They do not belong here. And every country is asking this question. Every single country is asking, what are we going to do with these Jews? Now, that's the Jewish question from the non-Jewish perspective. The Jews themselves recognizing and feeling that they're not being fully welcomed, that their host countries aren't saying you're one of us, are also asking the question, what's going to be with us? Where do we go? Right? What do we do? And throughout, we're going to look at some of the answers throughout the 200 years leading up to the 1940s. The Jewish question is being asked both by Jews and non-Jews. And it is a topic of essays. It's a topic of lectures. It's a topic of books that are coming out. It is one of the greatest intellectual questions being asked at the time, which is, and sociological questions being asked, what do we do with the Jews? I see it says Mark raised his hand. Mark, go ahead.
So, Rabbi, can you hear me?
Very well.
You're giving it as axiomatic that Jews in other countries do not have what would be called dual loyalty or maybe questioned loyalty. You're giving it as axiomatic that they do not, correct?
No. I'm saying that's how they're looked upon.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's the truth. A Jew in the early let's take how many we know. I'm not asking the question. I'm saying we know that there were thousands of loyal Jewish Germans who fought for the German army in World War I. They won awards. They felt as loyal Germans. That's why they fought for Germany. It wasn't they didn't have a mandatory requirement to serve in the army. These are people who willingly fought. And the same thing in the Russian army against the Germans, right? There were Jews fighting against Jews in World War I. And the reason why they felt that they should fight against a fellow Jew was because they saw themselves as loyal Germans. They saw themselves as loyal Russians. And therefore they felt that they belonged. But the non-Jews did not mirror that. Now, I'm generalizing, obviously, but society as a whole, Russians did not feel that Jewish Russians were full-fledged Russians like non-Jewish Russians. And Germans did not feel that German citizens that were Jewish were full-fledged Jewish citizens, German citizens, because they were Jewish, and therefore they were different, and therefore they're not like everybody else. And
okay, because in general, Jews have fought in higher numbers than their population percentage. And in fact, I think it was in the Civil War, there were many more Jewish generals than should have been represented by the populations of Jews in the country. And I think at one point Grant said that he was going to revoke all generalcy, all general ranks from Jews. And as soon as Lincoln heard that, he rescinded it.
Right, there was a special order. I think it was special order number 8. Right, I have a great, going back, grandfather that fought for the North in the Civil War. And that's something that that we're proud of. But that I'm not saying that I'm not talking truth. I'm talking perception. This was the perception of society at the time, and it's a perception that the Jews themselves, not that they felt because it was reality, they felt how their non-Jewish neighbors were viewing them. And
correct. Okay, I got it. Because after 9/11, there were calls for loyalty oaths. There were, again, which has happened throughout the centuries, there are calls for loyalty oaths from American Jews after 9/11 happened.
And look, and it's today the charge of dual loyalty is alive and well. It's not as popular. Popular is a horrible word. It's not as frequent or as prolific as it was 200 years ago in Europe, where this was a central question. If you and I would take a time machine back, 200 years ago, and sit around Jewish parlor rooms or sit around the Shabbat table, one of the big questions that was constantly being raised, and by the way, also in non-Jewish centers, one of the big questions being raised was, what are we going to do with the Jews? And the Jews asking themselves, what are they going to do with themselves? That was a big question being asked. You know, this is one of the more popular questions being asked.
Saturday through following what?
Okay, I'm not sure if that's a question, but I muted just in case. Okay, so that's my point. My point is just to bring up that this was the attitude. Now the question becomes, okay, what are the possible answers to the Jewish question? Right? That's the next question that we have to look at. Historically, how are people answering this Jewish question? Because the Jewish question wasn't rhetorical. This was a question that people had, and it was a question that they were looking for answers to. Okay, so let's see. So one of the more famous answers is, and this is a response. Karl Marx is going to write a response to this. This is in 1843, and the answer back to this idea of that there should be a special answer to Jews, that there should be, and I'll try to minimize myself on this so we could see more of the answer here. So here, as he says, no one in Germany is politically emancipated. We ourselves are not free. How are we to free you? You Jews are egoists if you demand a special emancipation for yourselves as Jews. As Germans, you ought to work for the political emancipation of Germany, and as human beings, for the emancipation of mankind, and you should feel the particular kind of your oppression and your shame, not as an exception to the rule, but on the contrary, as a confirmation of the rule. Right? This is the idea of looking at the Jews and saying, you're not special, right? You should not be working towards your own solution. You should not be looking to try to figure out a way. This is, by the way, very reminiscent. This is communism, right? This is classic Karl Marx communism, where Jews are not special. The answer to the Jewish question is assimilation. Assimilate into general society. Stop calling yourselves Jews. Stop looking at yourselves as unique. No, not, and I don't mean unique as better or worse. Stop looking at yourselves as if you have some special type of question that only applies to you. When society has ills, you should not be looking at yourself, okay, where can we go? You should be looking at how can we participate in society? How can we become humans like everybody else? How can we become Germans like everybody else? So the first answer that we see to the Jewish question is really erase the Jewish. If you erase the idea of being a Jewish nation, and you erase the idea that you're somewhat different than everybody else, then you'll see that there's no real question to ask. And it is a wonderful idea in theory, but in practice, this only goes so far as people are willing to accept you as Jews. Susan, do you have a question?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a comment on this. And, of course, I'm thinking like in America, but it's like, okay, so let's say we're Americans. We don't we don't go out and say, well, you go to a new job, you go, well, I'm Jewish. You're just, I'm an American. Well, a lot. Now I do live in, Dallas, but there are, in this area, I'm going to say in this country, I mean, a lot of people who will say they believe America is a Christian nation. So if you get rid of the Jewish questions, then like nobody should, no politician should go, well, and I'm whatever they are. I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, whatever. It just to me, if we don't identify as American Jews, if we identify as Americans, we're letting a lot of people just think, okay, so it's a Christian nation. I mean, I don't know if I'm making myself clear on that, but it just seems it seems like we're being hidden. And I mean this as a joke, but I don't mean this as a joke. I found out today, I think I have an anti-Semitic iPhone because I went to text JDate. I mean, JDate, I looked it up. It's existed since 1997. I went to text it to my friend. It corrected it. It made it heater. It made it, it's like, it does not acknowledge JDate. And I think I have an anti-Semitic phone.
And you say, okay, well, maybe you should visit the I don't know if it's an iPhone or, but check that out.
It is.
But,
it is. It is the iPhone 12 mini.
Okay, so you look that up. But so the idea that you're saying, I think America is somewhat unique because America is designed to be a melting pot, while the countries of Europe in the late, the last 200 years were not designed for that reason. So I'm not sure how much this Jewish question can apply to modern day America for sure. But this first idea, the communist approach to the Jewish question of, okay, erase your unique identity, stop thinking of yourselves as different, and then you'll go ahead and start seeing that there's that you'll be able to fit into humanity. Okay, now we know, and this is going to be this should, if you've never heard of the Jewish question before, this will tie a lot of loose ends to history for you. The Nazis called it the final solution, right? And we generally all know the term the final solution, right? And I always assumed, until I understood what the Jewish question was, that the reason why it was called the final solution was because the Nazis had many different solutions beforehand that didn't work out. And therefore, the final solution was the extermination of the Jewish people. In fact, that's not true. The reason why it was called the final solution is because the Jewish question had been on everybody's minds for hundreds of years. And different ideas had been thrown about and different, what to do with the Jews. And the Nazis finally said, okay, we're going to come up with the final solution so that the Jewish question never has to be asked again. What is this final question? Right? What's the final solution? Well, so that's the extermination of the Jews. Now, the problem is that German society and German culture and was looked upon themselves as of the highest degree. They looked upon themselves as people that were the most civilized and the most sophisticated, and for them to propose exterminating human beings is so far below the high standards of the Germans. So how could they justify such a drastic move of exterminating human beings? And the answer was that they added in a quality to the Jewish question that had never been added before, which is science. And what they said was, and I'll read this to you: the scientification of the Jewish question in Nazi Germany describes the attempt of a considerable number of German scholars to counter the vanishing influence of religious prejudices against the Jews with a new anti-Semitic rationale. Okay, as anti-Jewish stereotypes of old-fashioned soteriological kind had become dysfunctional under the pressure of secularization, a new, more objective explanation was needed to justify the age-old danger of Judaism in the present. In the 1930s, a new research field called Judenforschung, right, emerged. Its leading figures amalgamated racial and religious features to verify the existence of an everlasting Jewish problem. Along with that, they offered scholarly concepts for its solution. Essentially, what the Germans did in this Judenforschung was they said Jews are scientifically different and lower than the rest of humanity. They are Untermenschen. They are lower than the rest of mankind, and therefore it's perfectly acceptable to exterminate them. The same way no one hesitates to exterminate a rat. No one sits there and says, well, should we exterminate a rat? Should we not exterminate a rat? It's a rat. It's a rat. It's only there to spread disease. It's only there to harm people. So you exterminate it. That's what you do, right? Nobody sits there and says, oh, what are we going to do? How can we exterminate rats? How can we kill rats? Everybody's perfectly fine with killing rats. If you take the Jewish question and say the Jewish question is not a sociological question, It's not Jews are different than everybody else because they're Jewish, and therefore, the average Christian German is not a Jewish German, and therefore they're different, so we should separate the Jews from the non-Jews. But rather what we're saying is that scientifically they're lower than everybody, and that ratio of being lower means that they're harming the Übermenschen of the Germans, the higher German people. So then it makes sense that there's no other option but to solve the Jewish question with a final solution of extermination. So the final solution of the Nazis is built upon this Jewish question of hundreds of years. And that's where they come to the final solution of extermination. Obviously, this was not a solution that sat well with the Jews, right? This was, the Jews had never come up with this formulation and had never come up with the idea that they should be wiped out. But the scientification of the Jewish question in Germany in the 1930s begins to tell us just how drastic and just how in the forefront of everybody's mind the Jewish question was. We would like to assume that Hitler and his henchmen were obsessed with Jews, and they had a special problem with Jews. Well, nobody else was really thinking about this, but it's simply not true. For hundreds of years, everybody was asking the Jewish question. The Germans came up, Hitler and his people came up with the idea of a final solution that was more drastic than anybody had ever thought of in the hundreds of years that they were asking this question. But now we can understand and tie the pieces together of history of what was happening in World War II and during the Holocaust, and how a Holocaust comes to be. Because if you sit for hundreds of years and ponder the Jewish question and convince yourself after hundreds of years that this is a serious societal problem, that Jews in our midst, people who are not loyal to the same values that we are loyal to, people who are not the same as the rest of us, people who do not belong here, and you drill that in and talk about that over and over and over, eventually will lead to extremists coming to the fore and coming up with a solution as horrific as the Holocaust. So I'm hoping everybody sees that this is how serious the Jewish question was. Okay, now we can finally understand Zionism. Zionism really, in this formulation, even though it predates Nazi Germany, is really the flip side and the answer to the German final solution. And this is where Herzl steps in. Herzl came up, and I know this is going to sound horrific, but Herzl comes up with his own final solution. Now, again, his final solution is 60 years, predates the Nazis' final solution, right? Predates the Nazis' final solution by a good 60 years. So we're not saying that the Nazis had one final solution and Herzl had another. But Herzl essentially is trying to answer the Jewish question. Now, what's pushing Herzl to come up with a final solution? Because he sees rising anti-Semitic rates. So this is what Herzl says. He says, in this essay, and we're talking about the Jewish state, Der Judenstaat, it was actually the anniversary of its publication was this week. And in this essay, Herzl presents the main point of his understanding of the Jewish problem and its solution. He suggests a plan for the organization and establishment of a longed-for Jewish state. In the theoretical section of the essay, he proves that the Jewish nation is indeed a national entity. He discusses the failure of the emancipation and the inevitable rise of anti-Semitism. Okay, so he realizes that the Jews are a people, that the Jews need a solution to their problem, because as long as they are viewed as a problem, anti-Semitism is going to rise. And the only answer is going to be the creation of a Jewish state where Jews can determine their future. And that's what he says here. He says, I think the Jews will always have sufficient enemies, such as every nation has. But once fixed in their own land, it will no longer be possible for them to scatter all over the world. And the whole plan is, in its essence, perfectly simple. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we will manage for ourselves. Herzl doesn't think for a second that having a state will solve anti-Semitism, but at least we'll be able to handle it. As individuals spread out throughout many, many different lands, we can't handle the attacks against us, right? There's no way. But if we're together as a people, we have the ability to determine our own future and defend ourselves. You cannot have a pogrom against Jews in a Jewish state if there's a Jewish army. The Jewish army will prevent it. And that's Herzl's idea. Herzl's idea of the answer to the Jewish question is move us back. Get us out of Germany, get us out of France, get us out of England, get us out of America. Take us out of everywhere. Everywhere that the people view the Jews as a problem and they're puzzled by the Jewish question and challenged by it and what should we do with them? Move them to a Jewish state. There they will be safe. They will not be bothering anybody in their own countries. And everybody will say it, Shalom Yisrael. Everybody will be perfectly happy. And that's where Herzl comes up. And now we can fully appreciate Herzl's solution of Zionism and where Herzl was coming from. He was trying to answer this question, the Jewish question. Okay, now we're all familiar with Louis Brandeis, was a American Supreme Court justice, and we know that he was also the head of the American Zionist Association. He was the biggest American Zionist, right? So he actually competed with Chaim Weizmann to be the head of the worldwide Zionism. He lost. Chaim Weizmann beat him out. But this is Louis Brandeis. Listen to what he says. This is giving a speech to the Eastern Council of Reform Rabbis, and he says, "For us, the Jewish problem means this." Right away, what's Brandeis doing? He's addressing this Jewish problem. Now, you and I might sit here and say, "Wow, that's so great." He's saying that he's using the exact same language that we're talking about. But everybody was talking about this. This was not a big deal. So he says, how can we secure for Jews, wherever they may live, the same rights and opportunities enjoyed by non-Jews? How can we secure for the world the full contribution to which Jews can make, if unhampered by artificial limitations? The problem has two aspects, that of the individual Jew and that of Jews collectively. Only in Palestine, he says, can Jewish life be fully protected from the forces of disintegration. That there alone can the Jewish spirit reach its full and natural development, and that by securing for those Jews who wish to settle there the opportunity to do so, not only those Jews, but all other Jews will be benefited, and that the long perplexing Jewish problem will at last find, look at his language. His language is scary. Louis Brandeis talking about find a solution, right? That there will be a serious final solution to this problem of the Jewish question. And that's what Brandeis is referring to as Zionism. He's taking on Herzl's idea and ascribing to it, right, of what's the solution to the Jewish problem, to the Jewish question? A Jewish state. We can now really appreciate what Zionism is all about here. Right? What Zionism really came to do was answer this Jewish question. The wandering Jew, as much as we know, Jews were not nomadic. They weren't intense going from land to land. The Jews did not look like Bedouins and living in shacks, and moving from one well to the next. But the Jew was a wandering people. They might have found a home for a couple hundred years in one place or another, but reality was the Jews were not settled in a place that they could call home because they were not considered like everybody else. So that was the Jewish question. And what pushes Herzl, we would like to imagine that Herzl was pushed by the Jewish right to their own homeland. That's true. Those are all facts, and Herzl was working with those facts. But what was motivating Herzl more than anything else was this hundreds and hundreds of years old question of what do we do with the Jews? And the Jews asking, what do we do with ourselves? How do we fit in? Where do we go? Where are we able to, as Brandeis said so eloquently, where are we able to secure a future for ourselves and be able to improve ourselves, and at the same time be able to contribute to the world in the way that we know we can? That was the Jewish question. Okay, that's the end of. I hope you got something from this. If anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to make, now's your final chance.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So I'm sure you know the book Hitler's Willing Executioners
Yes.
by David Goldhagen, I think it was his last name.
I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, I believe David Goldhagen. It was his PhD thesis. He turned it into a book. And anybody that doubts that the Europeans, specifically the Germans, were just ignorant or didn't know what was going on, he showed Hitler's willing executioners. They were all in on the final solution.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, this was not a right. And again, now we understand why. Right? Didn't come out of nowhere. It's because people were artificially plagued by the problem of the Jewish question. They were told it was a problem for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's what they worked off of. Okay, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you next week.
Yes, yeah. Looking forward.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.